What is going on, everyone? Tim from Tierphone Orbital. So today I would like to go over and install commission that I completed on a very interesting staff. So this is a Grand Inquisitor from Wattos Junkyard, right? So staffs are a different breed all their own when it comes to designing a chassis for them and installing them, right? So you've got to think of a few different things. You've got to think of battery placement. You have to think of speaker placement. I think I spoke about this in a recent video. Staffs are you've got to approach them a little bit differently, right? And this was definitely a little bit of a different install, right? So this is a very interesting layout of a hilt. We've got perforated holes on each end of the hilt. So I had to think about where I was going to have my speaker placement for sound venting. I had to think about what type of chassis I was going to do. Is it going to be removable or static? So there was a lot of things that I had to think about before I went about designing the chassis. So I want to talk about all of that. So we're going to come into Fusion and talk a little bit about the chassis, and then we're going to come up top and talk about how to use this thing, because putting the chassis in the hilt is a little bit of a process, right? So this is not your run-of-the-mill unthread the pommel and put the chassis in, or unthread the grip and put the battery in. This is a very, there's a bit of a process to use this hilt, and I want to go over all of that, right? So we're going to do all that. So without further ado, let's come into Fusion and talk about the chassis first, right? Okay, so here is the chassis. Obviously a little bit of a different setup on this guy. We've got emitters at both ends of this hilt. I have placed lit PCB emitters at both ends of this chassis. However, these are not what will light the blade. And I will talk about that when we come up top. I've just done this for show, but these will actually make a connection to a secondary PCB on the outside emitters of the hilt. That probably does not make much sense, but it will make more sense when we talk about how to use the hilt, right? But essentially, these are just blade connectors that will make a connection to the outer emitters, right? So we've got lit PCB emitters at both ends. I've designed a removable chassis system for this. So we've got greeblies on one side of the chassis. Now, we've got a channel going down the other side of the chassis. This helps to clock the chassis, because the chassis has to go in a very specific way into the hilt, right? And we'll talk about that obviously when we come up top. On the body of the chassis itself, we have brass hat tactile switches. So there is a very keenly designed switch plate on the outside of this hilt that has some like spring plungers, spring loaded switches rather. And those are what make a connection to these brass hat tactile switches, right? We've got a kill switch here. There is a 2020 neopixel strip here, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we come up top. This has to do with the barograph on the outside of the hilt, right? Something that was really important to me when designing this hilt. Let's come down to the bottom. One of the really cool aspects of this hilt is this bar graph, right? So we've got a external bar graph on the outside of this hilt. I really wanted to get that usable, right? And one of the unfortunate things about proffieboard, there aren't that many unfortunate things about proffieboard, but one of the unfortunate things about proffieboard is sequencing, right? LED sequencing. I'm sure there are some very, very clever folks out there that can sequence LEDs with proffieboard, but you really can't sequence more than like 4 or 5 LEDs with Proffi, and especially bar graphs, because you've got, a bunch of LEDs in sequence on a bar graph. So you're very limited as to what you can do with an LED bar graph. You can either wire them all up and have them all pulse and blink, that's pretty much it, right? With CFX, you can probably sequence that whole bar graph, right? So I really, really wanted to get this whole thing lit in some way. So what I did was I created a very poor man's neopixel bar graph. And we'll talk about that when we come up top, right? So let's come back into Fusion. This channel, there is a 2020 neopixel strip that sits in this channel. And that is what gives us some shine through in that LED bar graph. I essentially made a lens bar graph, right? And we'll get a closer look at that when we come up top. Battery tray is here. Here is where our proffieboard will live. There's plenty of room to get your USB and your SD card if need be, right? So making our way up, I tried my hardest to get a 28 millimeter speaker in this chassis, and I just could not figure out how to do it, right? So I had to get 3 leads past this speaker for my upper PCB, right? And the only way I was able to do that was to get a smaller speaker in here. So we've got a 24 millimeter speaker here, and I had to get my wires past that speaker. So that's what this cavity is for right here. I put my speaker in, wire it up, and then I bring my leads past it all the way up to this PCB emitter right here. And there are some vents here that that's where we have our sound venting from, right? Once I wire everything up, this whole upper piece is epoxied in place. And then we're good to go, right? A lot of out-of-the-box thinking for this one. But, I mean, that's usually something, that's kind of what you have to do with staff lightsaber installs, right? Usually they're a little bit different. So let's come up top. Okay, so here it is. The Grand Inquisitor from Wattos Junkyard. Super interesting hilt, really, really big hilt. A lot of, there's a very interesting process to use this hilt to get the chassis out. So I want to go over all of that, right? But first, let's talk about this bar graph, right? And let's talk about the outside of the hilt. So as I was mentioning, this hilt did ship with a LED bar graph. It also ships with like a dummy bar graph and another like insert here, I guess, for just like display purposes. The first thing that I thought about when I got this hilt was I really, really want to get this bar graph lit. So I went about creating a faux bar graph for in here. Now I've done these before where I've done them like in resin. This is actually a combination of, let me get up by the camera. This is a combination of like FDM, like PLA. The frame around these lenses is PLA. Actually, I think I did that in carbon fiber. PLA. And then the clear lenses on the inside is just a resin insert. That way we get some shine through from that 2020 neopixel strip on the inside. And that is how we get a 2020 neopixel strip, essentially.
Tell me where the
okay.
Jedi is, or this man and his family die.
So that way we get an animated bar graph. And that can animate any way we want. It's its own blade in the config. Okay. So it's a very cool feature of the hilt. I knew I wanted to get that animated somehow. So anyhow, so let's talk about the hilt, right? That kill switch underneath. So here's the switch plate, right? One thing to note to the customer. Okay, so this switch plate, when I received this, it was missing a screw. Now this screw is not one of the switch screws. So when you depress these switches, these screws are what make a connection to these onboard brass hat tactile switches. This was missing a screw. During the install, these screws popped out all the time. I'm not sure why. I guess they are just very, very shallow threads on these. So just keep that in mind. These are very important, especially these two. Well, these four, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are what make a connection to the switches on the chassis. So just keep that in mind. They're very small. They're easy to get. They're easy to lose. So just watch out for that, right? This kill switch on underneath that switch plate, I cannot take credit for. This was actually the customer's idea, and I feel like that is just, it's a great idea. So it's easy access to that kill switch, and this being a Profi build, having a kill switch there is really, really, it's a great function, right? So there's the kill switch. Let's talk about how to get this chassis out of here, because it is a little bit of a process, okay? Both of these emitters unthread, so let's take those off. One thing I also noticed about this hilt that was a little bit confusing, okay? There are set screws for the blade on each emitter. However, they are, they are underneath these emitter caps. So my assumption is that you're supposed to put your blade in, tighten that set screw, and then put these over the blade, I guess. I don't know. Like, so this set screw, here, I'll do this one. This set screw is right here, okay? When you thread this emitter all the way on, it covers that set screw. So I'm not quite sure why that was done. Maybe because they just want that set screw hidden for display purposes. I don't know. But that's just something to keep in mind, okay? So once you get those emitter caps off, or whatever, emitter shrouds off, you want to unthread the inner emitters, okay? So very carefully start unthreading. Now watch out for these, because these are knuckle busters. You will hit your knuckles if you're not careful, right? So just unthread those one at a time. Now there are O-rings on the inside of these rings where the rings are connected. There are non-O-rings on the outside, which would help kind of with the clocking of these outside emitters, but they're not on the outside. It wouldn't make sense to have them on the outside, because it wouldn't help. You wouldn't really be able to get these disassembled. However, you can add them if you want to the customer. I think you did mention something about O-rings, if I'm not mistaken, right? So here is that PCB connector. This is just a blade side PCB, and we have a second lit PCB emitter in here, right? So this is what makes a connection to that chassis on the inside of this main body, okay? So once you get that one unthreaded, you can turn it around and do the same thing on the other end, okay? Now obviously I already have a battery in here, but we're gonna just disassemble this just to show you how to get it out. Same thing on this end, okay? And that will loosen this main body, okay? Now, the emitter end opposite this bar graph is the one that you want to unthread, okay? And then you can just pull that chassis out. So here is the chassis.
Tell me where the Jedi is, or this man and his family die!
So really, I mean, in all honesty, no real need to have these both blade side or hilt side PCBs, but I wanted to just have them lit for display. It looks cool to have them lit, and then you can use the chassis outside of the hilt. Right. So once you have your battery in, assuming that you're putting your battery in, to put your chassis back in the hilt, you can use this trench as a guideline. Line it up with that bar graph, okay? Slide it all the way in until it stops. Then you can thread that emitter back on. Whoops. Okay. Then you want to put the main body back in the middle of the ring. Then you want to take one of the emitters, kind of guide it into that middle section. Now again, there are O-rings inside of here, so you want to kind of help it find its way back to that inner part of the hilt. There we go. And then get it started. I just like to get it started and then do the other end. Let's turn this off. There we go. I like to make sure it's lined up, and you can tighten everything down. Okay. All right. Then you're good to go. I'm going to leave these off because I'm going to put a blade in each end, and that set screw needs to be exposed so I can tighten everything down. But there we go, right? Now, when putting the switch plate on, the long red button needs to go by that bar graph, okay?
Who's in the gutter now?
So interesting sound venting, right? So we have very, very small perforated holes on each end of the hilt, right? So sound vents right through here, right? So let's come down to the bottom. Okay, so there's that lit bar graph. I really, really wanted to get that as part of the install. I wanted to get that lit, right? Very awkward hold of this hilt. These staffs usually are. Okay, let's see what else we put on here. I just tried to switch up that bar graph for each font config. Okay. Let's put a blade in it. So 1-inch blade holder, right? You want to rest your blade on those PCB. Well, let me loosen that set screw first. So make sure your set screws are loosened, right? Rest your blade on those PCB pins. Then you can tighten your set screw. And then you're good to go. Oops. And then you're good to go. This is a very weird hold here. See what else we put on here.
Inquisitorious. You'll die like the rat you are.
All right. Let's go with one more. See if I can get twist to activate. There we go. Different animation on that bar graph. Tried to switch it up a little bit. Okay. Let's go with one more.
What is it? Father's lightsaber. The whip of Jedi.
Okay. And that's it. That is the Grand Inquisitor from Wattos Junkyard. Very interesting hilt, hefty hilt. This is a heavy, heavy hilt. See if that can focus that bar graph. Yeah, so that's one of the cool features of this hilt. That's one of the things that I wanted to get used on this hilt. I wanted to make sure that that bar graph was lit. So this was an interesting install. I had to think outside of the box. That's one of my favorite things to do with installs like this, is to really think about like an engineering solution as far as installs go, right? So anyhow, to the customer, thank you very much for your patience. We are coming close to the 4th of July holiday. This was finished last week. I will box this up as soon as I am done recording this video and get this on its way to you. Thank you very much for your patience. Everyone, if anyone has any questions about this particular install, please do not be a stranger. And with that being said, may the force be with you always. Have a good one, everybody.